Hi, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here at King Estate on June 13th, 2019. We're here with Ray Nuclo. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ray. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Let's start out with asking why grapes? What got you interested in viticulture?
Well, probably the main thing that interested me in it was the commitment to sustainability in the industry. And I was out doing my master's degree at Oregon State, and had always been interested in organic and sustainable ag. And so it wasn't directly related to my education. I was doing plant pathology, but I was working in orchards primarily at the time doing my research. So there's a lot of similarities between vineyards and orchards in terms of production. And then I also saw the growth of the industry. This was in the mid to late 1990s. And just felt like it was a exciting, growing field to get into.
So previous to grapes, you mentioned plant pathology, botany. What was the interest there? What got you down that road?
Well, going back to high school, I was very interested in science and biology. And early on in college, I kind of decided to start focusing more on botany. And then towards the end of my bachelor's degree, I took some courses in plant pathology, and one of the things I liked about plant pathology was that it has a real ecological aspect to it, and I always liked ecology as well. And so you're bringing in a multitude of things, including plants and the environment, and then also the pathogens, so fungi, bacteria, viruses. So just the interaction between them two, I always thought was real interesting. So
you develop an interest in viticulture, and you kind of see Oregon as a place on the rise. So tell me about where you started and what your kind of initial impressions were of Oregon as a wine industry.
Yep. So I started off working at a small vineyard west of Corvallis. It was owned by Lloyd Crisp, father of Di Crisp. So I had a mutual friend that introduced me to Di, and I expressed my interest in the vineyard and kind of just asked questions. And so he hooked me up with a job that summer. And so started off just doing field labor. And each year I kind of progressed from different jobs, but in the end I thought it was a really good way to come into the industry, because I saw pretty much from the ground up how everything gets done. Progressed pretty quickly year by year into management positions. And and again, one of the things that really drew me to working with Di was he was also very interested in organic viticulture. And back then it wasn't really, a lot of people were growing organically, but it wasn't something that you marketed as organic grapes. More so, I think there was, back then it was almost a negative connotation. People associated organics and wine with kind of lack of consistency and not always good quality. And so that's kind of one of the exciting things to see that perception kind of change, as most people were either growing organically because they felt like that was the right thing to do in terms of being a steward of the land, or another aspect of it would be that they felt like it produced higher quality grapes, but it wasn't something that you would bring out to the marketplace and advertise. So nobody back then would ask you for copies of your certificate or anything like that. Whereas now there seems to be a lot more interest in actually using that as a marketing tool.
So when you kind of entered the industry, what were your initial impressions of it, either kind of specifically or in general? What did you think about the work being done?
You know, I kind of felt like it was still pretty small scale, and kind of like you said at lunch, there was a real community feeling to it, and a lot of kind of potential to define what it was going to be. So there was a lot of excitement to it, I felt, and an opportunity. It was a real growing, I mean, it's gone through a number of growth phases, and when you probably compare it to some of the more modern ones, it probably wasn't the biggest growth phase back then in the mid to late 90s, but there was a fair amount of planting going on, and just felt like it was an exciting industry to get into that had a lot of growth potential.
Sure. Sure. So after working with the crisps, what's your kind of next step and kind of working your way up? What's your next step?
Went to Croft Vineyard, which when I started working at the Crisps Vineyard in Wren, that's the name of the vineyard, Wren Vineyard. Di was managing Temperance Hill, Croft. And so that was kind of my connection to Croft, and moved over to there a year after I worked in Wren, and started off there, again, field labor, some tractor driving, worked my way to assistant vineyard manager. Then I left there for a few years and worked on kind of a renovation project down the road from Wren Vineyard, a place called Cardwell Hill Vineyard, and sort of brought that vineyard, had been abandoned, and brought it into production for the new owner. And then shortly after that, I returned to Croft and took over vineyard manager there. And so I was there for a good 10 years at Croft, managing their vineyard. And that's where I developed a relationship with King Estate. I mean, I had gone to King Estate with Di one year delivering grapes in 1998, but when I really started working directly with them was in the early 2000s when we were selling grapes to them. And so continued that on until, in 2011, I started doing some consulting here with their estate vineyard, and then they asked me to come on in 2013 and to take over, to continue to sort of oversee the management of the estate vineyard, but then also to oversee all the contracted vineyards as well. So
it's a big task.
Yeah, and that stretches from Walla Walla, Tri-Cities, all the way down to Medford, Ashland area. Sure. So a lot of traveling. So
let me back up for a second before I talk more about that, because I'm really curious about that. When you got started, were there unforeseen challenges, things you weren't expecting about growing grapes specifically, or the wine industry in general?
I hadn't really grown up in an agricultural or horticultural setting, and so it was a little, it took a little bit to get used to sort of the cycle of oversupply and undersupply, and especially in Oregon, because there's not only market factors that influence that, but our ability to set fruit is so contingent upon the weather. Especially back then, it was much more common to have sort of variable weather at this time of year during bloom. And so, compared to a lot of growing regions where they can set their crop just by the number of shoots that they put out, and it may vary like plus or minus 10% or so depending on weather conditions, whereas here we can vary plus or minus 50-60%. So the difference from one year to the next in terms of how much fruit you have out there can be pretty dramatic. And then just getting used to some of the challenges growing organically in Oregon, and again, not having grown up in agricultural settings, dealing with the stress associated with growing organically, and if you do and get some disease out there. And I think having a background in plant pathology, for better or worse, I was really good at finding, let's say, mildew, and I don't know if it's lucky or unlucky, but sometimes I would just get out of the car and walk into a block and, oh, look, there's a little mildew, and then I'd have to spend the rest of the day looking and not finding much to assure myself that there wasn't this big problem going on out there. So it took me a little while to get used to not getting too stressed about things, especially if and I think a lot of that had to do with becoming more comfortable knowing that I was doing the things that you need to do, and I've never had like a really bad crop loss or anything, and so just after getting enough years of experience, it made life a lot easier growing grapes.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, when you're attached to a vineyard that is sourcing out or selling out all its own grapes, and you have that big plus or minus, how do you deal with that on an annual basis if you can't grow as many as you want?
Well, it's not too hard to deal with when you have too much, or when it sets really heavy because you're thinning fruit. Now, I did learn early on that one of the best ways to impress people or do a good job is to really nail down figuring out how much fruit you have out there, and when you do a crop adjustment, how to get it as accurate as possible, because wineries like to plan ahead, and they like to know how much fruit is going to actually be coming in. And when you bring way more or way less than they're expecting, it doesn't. You do a much better job leaving a good impression when they get what they're expecting. And so that was one area that I really put a lot of effort into. And having a science background and with statistics and sampling, that's one of the biggest things, is you need to have a good sampling regime. And so that was a challenge, but it didn't take too many years to figure out. I mean, there's still going to be some degree of error, but that's natural. So
you go from kind of small scale to this, where you're in charge of a lot of vineyards, estate vineyards here. So let's talk about the estate vineyards first, and obviously biodynamic, organic. So tell me about the challenges of scale here and trying to be biodynamic on something this size.
It was a little intimidating at first, especially given the initiative or the idea to convert to biodynamics was presented to me in the middle of the 2015 season, with the desire for the 2016 crop to be certified. So that was definitely intimidating. But I knew some people in the biodynamic community as well as in Demeter, which is the certifying agency. And so they were a really big help in kind of alleviating some of my concerns. And one of the things I like about biodynamics is it's not quite as black and white as organic. There's a lot of practices that they encourage you to do and that you can do to different degrees, and it's not you can do this, you can't do that. So we kind of did it in steps. And so, for instance, a lot of the things that we were doing here on the estate prior to even having the desire to be biodynamic were things that fit right into what they're looking for. And so, for instance, one of the big things with biodynamics is to limit what you're bringing from off-site onto your site, so your off-site inputs. And so we were already growing our own cover crop seed here. We compost all of the winery waste. We were already bringing sheep onto the property to help with early season vegetation control. And so a lot of those things were already in place, producing our own plant material, vines, and one of the big thing that we had to do was start to incorporate the biodynamic preparations. And so to get us started, we started off purchasing them, which we still purchase them, but we're in the process of producing some on site here. And so that gave us the ability to kind of phase into it. And in some ways, what I learned is that a scale, while it can be intimidating, it actually can be a positive. And so we have a lot of resources that might not be available to a smaller producer. And so we've got a vineyard mechanic, we've got a shop mechanic for the winery. So for instance, with the preparations, there's a process for putting them into solution, and it's somewhat involved in terms of needing to stir one direction and then stop and stir the other direction. And given the amount, you see some people doing this by hand, and given the amount of acres that we have to cover, we needed to come up with a mechanical way to do it, which is there's you can buy preparation stirs. They tend to be made in Europe and fairly expensive, but we just scavenged around for stuff that we had here on site and basically built one ourselves. And so, if I was just a 5-acre producer, I wouldn't have that ability to do that. And then it also takes a fair amount of labor, like not only in putting the application of the preparations out, but preparing them and getting them ready to be put out and calibrating equipment. And so, the King family, once they decide to do something, they're not gonna not back it up with the resources that you need to do it. And so, and again, when you're a larger company, you have those resources at your, available to you. And so I've always kind of looked at it more as a positive than a negative. And if I was tasked to do it and not given the resources necessary, then yeah, scale would make things really hard. But we converted one of our old sprayers into a biodynamic sprayer. We built so basically with a lot of equipment that we already had, some of it not being used anymore because it didn't suit our purposes or was antiquated, and we just would repurpose it. And we have the resources necessary. If you identify something that is a need and can justify the expenditure, then if it is needed to get a goal accomplished, well, it's going to be provided.
So you also mentioned your responsibility for vineyards off-site. So tell me about how that works and what it is you're doing as you're going and traveling to these sites.
So it's it varies depending on the time of year. One of the things is contracting the fruit. So that's what you're doing during the off season, and then primarily during the growing season, we have an expectation for how we want grapes grown, and it just involves interacting with the vineyard managers, owners, showing up at the right time. One of the things I learned early on was that, well, a couple of things. One, timing of our practices is really important, both from a cost standpoint, because if you do something at the correct time, it may still cost a fair amount, but if you do something at the wrong time, it's gonna cost you a lot more. And then a lot of these practices that we do are geared towards enhancing quality. And if they're done at the right time, they're gonna enhance quality, and if they're not, well, they're not gonna enhance quality. And so if you're a buyer of grapes and you have a presence in the vineyard and are requesting things to be done, you're going to be at the top of the list. And despite their best efforts, things are not always done on time in the vineyard, and it's the winery that shows up 2 weeks before harvest is the first time they've come out since the winter. Who knows when their leaves were pulled, or when their vines were hedged. And so you want to go out so that they know, the vineyard owners know what you want to get done, but then you also want to go out once they know how you want something done. Then you just go out so that it gets done when you want it done. And it's amazing how whenever you show up, like, the work's either just been done or the work's being done that day. And then the other thing I like to make sure that, because I came from the vineyard management side, the last thing you want to do is to tell somebody how you want something done and then show up after the fact and say, no, this isn't what I wanted, and either it doesn't get redone, in which case you're not happy, or the vineyard owner has to redo a job and they're not happy because they just spent a bunch more money. And so there's a few jobs in particular, the biggest one being crop thinning, where I like to be out there when it starts, like not a day or two after, but an hour or two after, so that if you do need to make some adjustments, they get made before much work has been done. And I think that the vineyard owners appreciate that. They'd rather have that as well. They want you happy, but they don't want it to be at extra cost either. So I think it's really important that the winery have a presence throughout the whole growing season with the vineyard, so that everybody's on the same page and expectations are being met. And I think that's what the vineyard, I know when I was a vineyard manager, in some ways I took it as a compliment that people were confident that things were being done. But at the same time, I preferred when there was at least some sort of recurring presence from the wineries.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I know this is a silly question given all that you do, but describe a typical day for me at work.
You know, a typical day during the growing season would involve probably going to anywhere from 4 to 6 vineyards. Sometimes meeting with, depending on how many vineyards, sometimes I'll meet with the vineyard managers. If I need to get too many vineyards done in a day, I'll sometimes not announce that I'm going to be around, because vineyard managers are a lot like truck drivers in that they don't have a whole bunch of interaction, and so when they do, sometimes conversations can go on and on, and next thing you know, you were hoping to go to 4 vineyards and you're only on your second. But typical day is just going out, and again, at this point, I have a really good group of growers that I've been working with for a long time. Every year there's a little bit of change. We'll have a few new growers, and that'll tend to be a little bit more work on my part in terms of making sure we're all on the same page and they know what we want to get done. Most of my growers, they know what my expectations now are, and so it's just a matter of having a presence so that your expectations are being met in a timely fashion. And just maintaining good relationships with your growers is really important, and I think that takes a fair amount of work, particularly during harvest when there's competing interests sometimes going on there. And so, for instance, yesterday I was out in the Silverton area, and we have a bunch of Pinot Gris that gets grown out there, and pretty large vineyards, but most of the time I was just walking vineyard blocks, and I would rather walk a vineyard block than, sometimes they'll have Kubotas or these little ATVs, and you can see more ground that way, but it's not quite as intimate with the vines, and I think you overlook things, and you're also more at the whim of you're going where the driver wants to take you, as opposed to maybe where you want to go. So usually I like to do that part on my own. And then if I have an issue or something that I feel like needs to be discussed at that point, I'll call the foreman or the vineyard manager and see if we can get together and take a look at something. And so, but for the most part, a typical day involves just walking a bunch of vineyards, which, there's a lot of driving, but at least I have a good destination that's outside. So
sounds very peaceful.
Yeah, at least during this time of year.
Sure.
At harvest, or once we start, the two busiest times are when we have to sample to do our crop estimates, and then when we have to sample for harvest. And that gets a little crazy with the number of vineyards that we in the geographic area that we have to cover. So.
Huge amount of area. Sure.
Yeah.
So tell me what it is you want your grapes to express when they're made into King Estate wine.
In general, what I like to see is that you are maximizing the potential of any given site. And so you really have to first identify what you're looking for out of a given site, and what you feel the site can deliver, and then figure out how you can maximize that. And so it'll vary from program to program, variety to variety, and but in the end, what I'm really looking for is that the grapes are expressing where they're grown. And we do, and that can be down to the specific vineyard in the case of all the vineyard designates that we make, as well as just an overall region. So we have a lot of wines that are specific vineyard, small production wines, and there you're really pushing for it to exhibit a specific site. And then we also have more of our flagship wholesale distributed blends, and so there you're looking more at expressing what it means to be a Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, or say a Southern Oregon Marsanne-Roussanne, where you're bringing in grapes from a couple of different vineyards and blending them together to kind of optimize the expression of that particular area.
So as you look in the future for King Estate and for your role here, what do you see as you look, say, 10 years down the road?
It's one of the things that I'm pretty excited about is, and Justin brought this up during lunch, is the Sauvignon Blanc. So I've been growing Sauvignon Blanc pretty much the whole time that I've been in the industry, because Croft was known as a Sauvignon Blanc site. They had when I started, they still had some of the own-rooted vines there. One of the big projects that I had at that site was replanting it, because it was going down to phylloxera at the time. But Croft was one of the few sites that planted Sauv Blanc and actually continued to grow it. Like, there was a number of vineyards early on that tried Sauv Blanc and ended up ripping it out. And I think, especially because they're own-rooted, it's a little bit harder to grow Sauvignon Blanc in Oregon when it's own-rooted, especially back then when we were in not quite the warm pattern that we're in now. So I've, for a long time, had a passion for it. And I brought it up maybe 5 years ago or 6 years ago, and at a sales meeting, and it didn't really get any traction or anything. We had been making a Croft Vineyard Sauv Blanc, which everybody loved, but as far as a larger production one, we hadn't done that yet. And so we were kind of searching for things, what our next thing to do, or different ideas, when we sold the Acrobat brand. And that was one that I threw out there was, what about a nationally distributed Sauvignon Blanc? It seemed to me like I knew that we could grow it well here. It's a pretty popular variety right now, especially with the rise of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc as a cool climate version of it. And but at the same time, nobody was really doing a cool climate Sauvignon Blanc, not on any scale in Oregon yet. So we're pretty excited about it. We're hoping that it goes over as well as we think it will, and kind of looking at maybe doing to Sauvignon Blanc something similar to what we did to Pinot Gris, which there's a lot of Pinot Gris planted out there, but there wasn't, not so much in Oregon, there was some, but there wasn't a nationally recognized brand that specialized in Pinot Gris, and that was something that we wanted to do and did it well. So we'd like to potentially emulate that with Sauvignon Blanc.
Sure. You mentioned earlier that when you started, that organic wasn't necessarily a buzzword that you would use. Is that the biggest change you've seen in the viticultural part of the industry, or is there something else that's a bigger change?
Well, I'd say kind of that's a pretty big change, but the other one that I would probably put out there is crop loads, like looking at crop loads. And when I first started in the industry, it was, everything has to be 2 tons per acre, and it didn't matter where your site was, what your spacing was, what your soil was. And so none of that ever made sense to me. And through the work that they've done, Patty Skinkis has done at OSU, I think we've come to realize that it is maybe a little bit not quite as clear cut. There may be some sites out there that 2 tons per acre, that's what makes sense for that site. But then there's other sites out there that probably a higher crop load actually will give you a higher quality than a lower crop load would, especially if you want to keep your vines in balance. So I'd say that's a pretty big change. Is wineries being more open to higher crop loads on the vines. And from an economic standpoint, that also really helps, just in that, unfortunately, wine prices, the amount that you can charge for wine does not go up at the same rate that costs of inputs go up. And so that was definitely a big, I don't know if game changer is the right word, but very helpful to know that we can grow somewhat higher crop loads without affecting quality or lowering quality.
What about for the industry in general, as you look forward 10, 15 years? What do you see Oregon wine looking like? What changes do you see on the horizon for it?
I'd say probably the varietal makeup is going to diversify and expand for a number of reasons. One obviously being climate change. I think in some ways we're lucky that we started off as a cool growing region, because we have plenty of varietals to incorporate into the mix as the climate does get warmer. So I'd say that is one big thing, and you already see it happening. There's a lot of interest in, I wouldn't say obscure varietals, but varietals that Oregon at least especially the Willamette Valley, aren't known for yet. And then the other thing I'd say is it'll just be interesting to see how the trend of larger out-of-state wineries, companies move into Oregon, and it already has been pretty interesting, and sometimes I would say it's been a positive, and sometimes maybe not so positive. I think there's been different approaches that have been taken by people that have moved in from out of state, in California in particular. But in general, I think it's probably a positive, so long as it's handled well. And so, if you, in some ways it's inevitable that it's going to happen. You work really hard to make a name for something, and naturally people are going to want to get in on the action, right? So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So what advice would you have for someone who wanted to enter the Oregon wine industry today?
My advice would be to try to get exposed to as much. I mean, you may have a particular area that you're interested in within viticulture or winemaking or marketing, and my advice would be to try to broaden your experience as much as possible into, because really if you're well-rounded and understand all the different aspects of it, your chance of success is much greater than if you, it seems like these days people really want to focus and focus and focus and try to be like the very best at one thing. And that's great and everything, but there's the wine industry is so intertwined and so reliant on all aspects working well that if you don't understand how another part of the industry works, you're going to be definitely at a disadvantage, I think.
Sure.
So.
Okay, so that's all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything else I should have asked? Anything else we didn't talk about that we should have?
I don't think so. That I can think of.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for your answers. I really appreciate it.
And, it's not back in here, is it? That guy, I tell you, man.